Hey everyone, welcome to the Shrink Think podcast. We are excited to be here as always, but we're always especially excited to be here when we've got other people with us because, hey, the more the merrier. Nathan and I are a party, but we
We are
love when people can.
perpetually excited.
You've never heard us not excited. I don't know if that's a good thing or not, but we love it. So we're excited to be here today. And especially when we've got a guest on our show, it makes it even more exciting because we love to introduce people, to let you get to know somebody else, and also just to share some new, different perspectives and wisdom that we don't have that, we just love learning along with you guys as a listener. So today we've got on the show Andrew Lang. He's an educator in the Pacific Northwest and alumnus of Richard Rohr's Living School for Action and Contemplation. I think you should contemplate that for a second, what that means. Just kidding. Haha. Dad joke. And he's an author of a book called Unmasking the Inner Critic: Lessons for Living an Unconstricted Life. And along with writing regularly, he facilitates workshops helping people to navigate their inner lives and explore their sense of identity and spirituality. He's got a website that you can find more of his writings and offerings at Andrew G. Lang, like gangsta, andrewglang.com.
Oh my
And
word.
I gotta say, this comes from, I grew up in Seattle, in Ballard, which was at the time like not the greatest neighborhood, and it has become like hipster and bougie and all that kind of stuff. So that's where the G came from. He grew up, I think, in the hipster.
Gentrification.
Yeah, he grew up in like the new version of it. So apparently he's a Pacific Northwestern, grew up in Seattle, went to my rival school. I went to Ballard, he went to Ingram. So we're trying to bridge the gap between rivals on the show as well. So anyway, Andrew, welcome to the show. Thanks for being here.
I need to do my protective piece. I didn't grow up in the current version of Ballard. I grew up in the middle stage where the condos were just beginning.
Okay. And there were no condos. They had not heard of condos when I
No,
grew up.
I remember when I was young and I heard condo for the first time and I was like, what is this monstrosity that is occurring? And that's
Yeah,
when I
because they
left.
were like kind of like high-rise sorts of things that, it
Yeah.
was like an old town, an old Swedish person sort of a town, like single level, couple level, whatever, run down-ish. And now, yeah, condos and restaurants and all that kind of stuff. So
Yeah.
So Andrew, tell us a little bit about yourself, like your story of, who you are and really how you got into doing this teaching, writing, and inner critic work.
Yeah, totally. Well, I'm stoked to be here. Also perpetually excited.
Yeah.
Yeah, I I got into this work mostly just doing my own stuff, processing my own experiences. I think that's really the primary driver for me is somewhere in college, post college, I realized the stories that I had been handed that included stories about who I was, self-worth, identity in the world, uh, purpose, meaning. All I realized a lot of those stories didn't match the person I was becoming. They didn't fit right in my body, and so it led to a lot of introspective work around where did the stories come from for me. Were they from my parents? Were they from growing up in like a faith institution? Did it come from growing up, with the people who I was around? Or were these stories that I had kind of weaved for myself, and they were just stories of younger me that I needed to figure out a way to see them and let them go. So I think that's where a lot of it came from for me. And then where it really got the juice for me was I began to share with other people the practices I was doing, the questions I was raising, and realizing other people were doing the same stuff. Other people were grappling with the same issues of like, the stories I was handed don't work for me anymore. And either I want to engage, but I have no idea how, or I am engaging in those questions and reorienting to who I am, or I'm running the complete opposite way because the questions are so dangerous to my being and sense of identity. So I think I got a lot of juice from that of just realizing I wasn't alone in the questioning process.
It's interesting because I'm curious. I think our listeners are really going to love this. There's So we a long time ago in the podcast did an episode on internal family systems, and I bring that up because a lot of things that you're, I think, intuitively going to be sharing is an entirely different language for how to explain the inner world and some things of what's going on for people. And it's super helpful because I think the language in and of itself is what actually helps us gain movement in whatever we're doing, like from a mental health perspective, which is why some people really like CBT or something, and other people just don't jive with it. And so I want to put it out there because I'm thinking some of our listeners are going to think that this sounds familiar, but I would challenge you and say, well, it's probably familiar, but it's going to be a different way to look at everything. And one of the things you'd shared in the beginning was some of this is coming from a Jungian perspective, Carl Jung. I think it would be helpful for the audience if you could define this whole idea. I mean, not to go into this gigantic definition of Jungian therapy or theory.
But just a little bit of your teaching hat right here, not like if you open your textbook,
right.
Yeah.
But I think defining the whole shadow idea is going to be helpful.
Yeah, totally. So here's my like quick and dirty definer on shadows. As we grow up and experience life, what our shadow self is, or the shadows that kind of occur in our stories, they're the parts of ourselves that we don't want to deal with. They're the parts of ourselves that we kind of cast into the background in order to maintain an identity that works. So, for example, when we walk around the earth, there are parts of our identity that are incentivized, and there's parts of our identity that are applauded. And then there are parts of our identity that aren't. And so we often shove those parts down deep. And so the Jungian aspect of this is just naming that the shadow self are these very important, vital aspects of us. They might be narratives, they might be experiences that we've had that we've allowed to settle down deep in our story and not really take a look at. Where that really has a lot of impact for me is around inner critic work, because what that can turn into is that you've got a lot of narratives that are rolling around in your head, but you never look at them. And if we don't look at them, then we operate from them in the world, like on autopilot. And that's where I think a lot of harm comes in. Yeah.
Yeah. So when you say narratives, these, I think if I understand it right, I will tell people, kind of break it down a little bit more and say, like, these are just the things that you believe that you don't even necessarily know that you believe, or the thoughts that you have, or the thought patterns that you have, or the reasons why you think the things that you think that come from somewhere. But if you look at the things that you're thinking, look at the things that you believe, those are your narratives.
Totally. I mean, here's a very concrete example of a narrative that I have experienced in my life, but like this feeling of control. I'm not in control. And when and I'm, as a teacher for the last 7 years, right, I'm highly incentivized to pretend that I have some sort of control when you've got 30 high school kids running around your classroom. Any teachers listening, there's no such thing as control, as you know. But that narrative of that I'm not in control can lead me, if I'm not paying attention, if I'm not naming it for myself and saying this is a real part of me that needs tending to and needs some questioning around, I have this practice that I sometimes lead people in called a texturing practice, where just like you put texture on a wall, you put texture on a narrative that you have, you put texture on a feeling that you're experiencing. If we don't do those kind of practices to understand the layers of our narratives, then we go into our workplace with that narrative operating without us knowing in our heads. And what are we going to do? We're going to blow our trauma through other people's bodies. We're going to blow the impacts of that narrative, of that fear, right, through other people in our attempts to prove ourselves, or our attempts to embody the identity that is respected and affirmed in that space.
That feels like I mean, as you're saying that, I'm like, okay, that's a lot of It's a lot of feels. One of the things that I, in working with using IFS, internal family systems, the shadows that you're defining, or that you're as you're explaining it, would probably be the exiles of IFS. It sounds like, and so the component that I run into sometimes with folks in doing IFS is them having issue. Some folks will have issue two different ways. One will be there is, as I found, about 10% of the population that cannot imagine. They just don't have the ability to do it. So that, and then there's the other component that I'm wondering about, as far as if you ran into any of this is in your work, is people that are going, I don't feel anything in my body at all. I don't know what you're talking about. Like, what are you saying?
Oh yeah. Oh my God. Well, and that's, I think that's the impacts of our disembodied culture, right? Like we are incentivized to just keep going, to, all the statements that we have are colloquialisms, right? Like rub some dirt on it, brush it off. All these statements that basically tell us to don't pay any attention to your body's experience. um, I I'll share a story really quick because I think it kind of drives that piece home. When I was 18, I was leaving a community that I'd basically grown up in. I had chosen baseball over this community for years. But I still knew everyone there. And so we had this big going away party because my family was moving across town. And I was finding myself just bawling my eyes out. And it was all around, even though I had chosen baseball over really seeing many of these people, they were still my people. They were still like pillars of my upbringing. So I'm bawling my eyes out, and this tall man comes from across the room, and 6'2", 6'3", 6'4", somewhere in there, big long strides, and he puts his hand like real firm on my shoulder, and he just goes, "Men don't cry." And first off, just ugh.
Yeah.
Holy
That
hell.
was terrible.
Yeah, and in the moment, that was my first real experience of like this embodied feeling of like, this is gross, this is wrong, like there's something that doesn't match here. And in the process of unpacking that experience, I realized, because what he was doing was his inability to experience his own stuff, his own emotions and feelings, and just his body's desire to cry, right? What he was doing is he had spun narratives around, that he was taught around men don't do this. And he was then putting it on me. He was blowing his stuff through me. And there's so much. And so when I work with folks, I think one of the first things, and especially with men, in my experience, one of the first things is, what are the basic body sensations that you have? What does it feel like when you touch the texture on your wall? What does it feel like when you put your hands on your face? Because it's like a whole different language. And so I've gone into spaces where I've done these practices where, I've asked people to, if you're feeling angry right now, where is that showing up in your body? And of course, a person's like, what?
It's showing up in my body. Is that normal? Is there something wrong with me if it's showing up?
What body are you talking about? You said your body.
Exactly. Yeah. Like, what is the medical diagnosis of this situation?
Right.
And so I think you have to start earlier than that, and you have to start with saying your body has a language. We have been incentivized not to pay any attention to it. And so small little steps, just like when you learn a different language than the one you've grown up knowing, is you need to start playing with the foundations of that language. What does it feel like when you walk? What does your feet feel like when they hit the ground? Right, the simple things, and then you can build up to the point of realizing, oh, every time, this is my story, but like every time I'm angry, every time I'm worried about control, where does that show up? Tense shoulders every time. In fact, the tense shoulders happen before I can name the anger or the out of controlness. And so it's a flag for me. The body knows before I do.
Yes, I love that, because it's highlighting that there's like, we are a system, right? We're like a machine or a system that functions a certain way, and all of us function the same way, hardwired, meaning like we have thoughts and feelings that go together. We have a thought and then a feeling, or a feeling and then a thought, but we just know that they go together. And those feelings then manifest themselves in the body, generally in the kind of the same ways, or in the same places, or the same kind of regions of the body, or the same general sensations, because that's how feelings work. But each one of us can interpret those things or respond to those things in our own sort of individualistic kinds of ways. But what you're describing is, this is the way that the system is working, and it happens without it, just like unconsciously, it happens without us being aware of it. And it's doing stuff. It's telling us to respond to the world. It's telling us how we're interpreting things in the world. It's telling us what we believe about ourselves and about other people. And all of this is just happening in the background. So what I hear you describing is like, we need to pay attention to these systems and tap into them so that we can change them, or we can take control of them, or we can rewire them, which doesn't mean that you can change like the feelings that you're feeling, like, unplug and just be like sadness instead of anger. But it's more like how, or to what intensity, or even why I'm responding to certain things, because there are these patterns that we need to be aware of. And when we can tap into them, we just take more control rather than be on autopilot.
Totally. A phrase I used to use, I don't use it as much anymore, but it made a huge impact on me, was as it's a two-parter. The first part is we need to learn how to say it is what it is, both internally with our body, our emotional life, like be able to name it without judgment of just like, this is a thing that's happening. My body feels this way, or I'm thinking this thought. And externally, this thing I'm seeing in the world is happening. It is real. And then the second part of that statement is, and how can I be present with it in a loving way, or a peaceful way, or a kind, whatever language you want to use? How can I be with it, not as a annihilator? I'm not here to like get rid of my all of my anger, because anger serves a purpose. There's a reason we have it. But how can I be with it so that I can understand it and walk with it in a way that's healing and not harmful?
One of the things that you mentioned earlier that I don't want to we move through it quick, is the idea that, and this is for you therapists out there that are listening also, and for everyone really, but the idea that for some folks, they're going to need to practice ahead of time. It's this idea of being mindful, some kind of task that, like washing dishes, for example, something that's simple, repetitive, where you just completely tune in to what it is you're doing in that moment. Because you have to have some kind of starting point to begin to understand that you are embodying something. You are an embodied system. You are not simply the thoughts and feelings that you have. You are more than that. And like Aaron, you were talking about, and it was kind of I know that you weren't doing, trying to overgeneralize, but about like, how your feelings are in certain spaces, generally speaking. The other piece of that pie is that when you get more into this, you'll also learn that there may be, like, people will, for example, when I'm doing IFS, they'll say, oh, this part's in my chest. And the more we get into it, they'll be like, oh, that part is too. But then as we start to go, they'll find out like, nah, not really. That one's more off to the left and the other one's more off to the right. And you start to understand how your body is literally experiencing the world. And that is not just the creation. It's like other people that are in the world, and also your previous history. What I was wanting to ask you, Andrew, is there something that you find yourself kind of repeating? I don't know if you've kind of already done it, but like this idea that, man, I feel like I keep saying the same thing, as people are maybe not picking it up, or maybe you're just impassioned about it.
Well, it kind of goes with what you're just saying. So the phrase that I always use, and I think it's a hard one to embody, is that all of this work is capacity building. And we're attempting to build our capacity to be more aware of our aliveness. Build our capacity to be more aware of what it means to be human, build our capacity to experience more of our emotions in a holistic way, and not a way that drives us into reactivity. So I think one part is that, but the other part that that you just said that I immediately came to mind is Casper ter Kuile. He wrote the book The Power of Ritual. He defines a ritual as something that's done with intention, attention, and repetition. And in my mind, that's what we're talking about. Like when you say like washing the dishes, it doesn't matter what it is. How are you building a capacity by choosing something that you can bring a posture of intention to. I'm doing this for a reason. Attention, I'm fully in it. I'm noticing, that's the mindfulness piece, right? I'm noticing all the complexities and the stuff that's happening right here before me. And I'm going to do that every single day over and over again. And in the book, he talks about the difference between a ritual, what has those three things, and how often we just have habits. Every morning I wake up and I make my coffee. There's no intention, really. The intention is just to get the coffee. There's zero attention. Absolutely not. There's like coffee grounds spilled everywhere. It's garbage, nonsense, chaos land, as long as I get the product. So I think of that is, what when I go to my therapist, what my therapist is helping me do is see the things that I need to bring that posture of intention, attention, and repetition to. My therapist is inviting me into a capacity building process, and the work isn't in his office. Like, there's a pointer. He's a guide. He can help, but like the work is me then going out into the world and getting serious about the hard work of practicing that capacity building.
I love this. This is like you're so right on. It's like the therapist is asking questions or examining things or just exploring and trying to discover things about you that you might not have even known were there, or you might not have realized need to be explored. But it's the thing that I always say, it's like therapy in some sense is helping you as a person move from the habits, or what I call autopilot.
Yep.
So many people are just on autopilot. They don't even know what they're doing, why they're doing the things that they're doing. And I can ask a question like, oh, well, tell me about that. Why did you do that? And they're like, I have no idea. And in some ways it's shocking to me, because it's like, wow, are you not aware, or do you not have attention to, or did you not carry a specific intention to what you're doing? And it just happened kind of without your knowledge. I mean, it started somewhere. You had it some specific intention somewhere, but then it just moved into a habit and you cleared it from your mind. And from that standpoint, you're just limiting your capacity, because you're not even present with the things. You're not bringing yourself to the things that you're doing. And so therefore they're out of your control, out of your awareness, out of your power, essentially. Is that accurate, would you say?
Yeah, and there's a gentleness to it, I think, right? Like, we're all, and I think that's where we named before we started recording, but like, this is heavy work, realizing that we've been running on autopilot for X number of years. And there's also an invitation to gentleness and softness, which is that like, and you're here, and now you're noticing it. And so how are you going to be gentle with the story that got you here, and say, and there's a deeper depth that I am now interested in diving into. James Finley, he was a monk for 6 years, and then he's been a psychotherapist for the rest of his career. He's now retired, but he has this phrase that just always hits in such a poetic way for me. And he says, if we're not careful, we can find ourselves skimming over the surfaces of the depths of our own lives.
Ooh, can you say that again?
Yeah.
That is so good.
Says, if we're not careful, we can find ourselves skimming over the surfaces of the depths of our own lives.
Oh, and we're missing so much deep, meaningful stuff.
Yeah. And I imagine myself, I remember the first time, so I was sitting in a lecture hall with him when he said that the first time. And I remember this vivid, visceral image came over me of me on this boat in these waves, and they're not huge waves, but they're waves. And I'm looking down into the water, and two things hit me at the same time. The first was, I really wonder what it would be like to dip my toes in, not dive, because diving is terrifying, right? You don't know what's down there, but like, what would it be like to play a little? And then the second one was this fear of, what if there's nothing there? And I think a lot, I don't think, I've heard this from folks I work with, that a lot of the stuff that keeps us from going deep in this kind of inner work, however you want to describe it, and whatever modality you're working with, is this fear of, what if there's nothing there? What if this is it?
Mhm.
What if this is just it? And I think there's a softness and a gentleness there too. And saying, where does that story come from in you, and what's connected to that story?
Can I ask kind of a connecting piece, like, and I want to make sure we can get to some of the shadow work. So, but as we're talking about all this, like, be gentle, be aware, all that kind of stuff. I'm thinking if I'm listening to this, like, it all sounds interesting and great, but like practically speaking, like, what's the benefit of this? Like, I know I've got some clients that are always challenging me, like, okay, I understand that. Like, what do I do with it? Or like, and it's not so much what do I do, but more like, what is the practical implication? What benefits will I
What
see
am I
in
going
my
to get?
life?
Yeah.
What's that?
Yeah.
What am I going to get?
Yeah, what am I going
What's
to
going to
get
happen?
from doing this work? How am I
Yeah.
going to change?
My answer that I usually, I mean, I don't know if it's an answer. My take on this when I work in my spaces uh is that it's about you, and it's about beyond you.
Mm,
And it's about your communities and the people you surround yourself with. Most of the folks that I work with are activist types, or folks that they see the issues of the world and they want to, in some small way, make a difference. And the reason this work is vital is that the posture you carry when you step into collective spaces is the posture you are inviting that space to then mirror.
mm,
And I think that is so vital, that I refer to it as curmudgeonly energy. When we're just kind of curmudgeon through our life, and you can picture Scrooge or whatever image of curmudgeon you've got. But when you're closed off, tight, hunkered down, just crabby at the world, crabby at yourself, and you step into a space, what energy are you inviting? You're not inviting dancing energy. Like you're and so the why for me, the
mm,
practical, what are you going to get? Um, you're going to get the folks around you to you're going to invite the folks around you to see themselves in a way that's not curmudgeonly. You're gonna and that's how we change our communities. That's how we shift our cultures in ways that are healing. On a much more personal basis, what are you going to get? um, I call it aliveness, but a sense of depth and a sense of vibrancy in your aliveness. I remember a few months ago, I was out on a beach, and my friend was walking with me, and my friend's a poet, and uh, we're just walking along, and he jumps up on this log and like walks along the log, just like, most of us did when we were 4, 5, 6 years old. And my entire body was like rigid, because I was like, no, my hands are going to stay at my sides. No, I'm going to stay on I'm going to stay on these rocks as I'm walking. I can't play. And
mhm,
I
mhm,
think that, what do you get from this? Um, when we do our inner work and we really, it's slow. But when we do these kind of daily practices, these capacity building, um, you return to a playfulness and an aliveness and a vibrancy that I think we all have some version of a memory of. And it's not going to be exactly the same as when we're 4 or 5, and our experience at 4 or 5 is very different from each other's. Um, but but I think that's really a powerful image for folks, that there is something more, and that moreness is already there within you once
I think.
you, yeah.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, no, I didn't mean to interrupt you. And I was just thinking, when you're describing the log incident, that's a perfect example of what you're talking about when you walk into the collective of folks, and then you're inviting them into who you are and what's going on, because your friend invited you into playfulness, and your response was, "Nope,
Yep.
I'm not doing that." So the invitation is denied, sir. We're not.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's a huge, like, just naming that, like, are you walking around with denying energy? Like, are you, and if energy is the wrong word, like, if that's not resonating, like, just check your behavior. Are you walking around saying no a lot? Like, are you
yeah,
walking around defaulting to no without ever realizing you said no? There's another story, but a couple of years ago I was engaged, and as we had gotten engaged, all of a sudden everything kind of hit the fan, and we realized, oh, that was a bad decision. Like, there, we've got some stuff we need to work through if this is ever going to be a thing. And one of the core pieces of it was that one of us had very yes energy, said yes to basically everything. I'm going to go buy a snowboard because I'm going to go snowboarding for the first time. I'm going to drop, X amount of money, and I have the ability to do that because I'm going to go do this thing. And then one of us, me, had very no energy at the time. I was still formulating who I was. And so I was in a protective state of, really, my default is no, I'm going to have these really hefty boundaries. And boundaries are extremely important. And boundaries that keep you in a posture of no all the time can become really unhealthy when you go beyond the season for which that is helpful.
So what I would hear from that, like, so what do I get from that, or what's my takeaway? You said, like vibrancy and aliveness. I think those are all true. And I would even say, kind of from my standpoint, it's like you're missing out on some of the excitement, the joy, the adventure, the discovery, the exploration of life. You might be, you're kind of describing what children are like when they are playing together. It's like, one kid says to another, "Hey, do you want to play?" They're just like open. And another one's like, "Sure," and then they explore, they imagine, they discover, they create new worlds of imagination and connection that are, if you've had any kind of meaningful experiences or relationships in childhood, that are so valuable. That's kind of what life is really about. And so you're open to and engaging with the world and with other people in a way that's not just so like, "Well, we've got an hour for this meeting. It was great talking with you. Thanks for coming to coffee. See you next time." It's just so much more meaningful and, just exciting, I think. And even some of the just actual experiences that, if you're open to saying yes to, you might surprise yourself on some of the things that you like and enjoy. Kind of reminds me of I went to I went to Paris and Italy this summer, and I spent a couple of days in Venice by myself, and I wanted to make sure I tried a little family owned, on the outskirts of the city, restaurant. And it was an all seafood dish. And I'm not a huge seafood person. I like a lot of seafood, but it was totally new to me. And one of my favorite things, I guess I should say, on the entire trip was that place, because I tried some seafood things that I had never heard of and never would have ordered on my own, but I was open to it. And it was incredible, delicious, great views. The people around me were incredible. It's just like those kinds of experiences, like that energy you're inviting into your life, that create memories and create meaning and value. I guess that's kind of what I hear, just to expand on that.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think there's another aspect of this, which is that we all hit different intensities of the, everything hitting the fan moment, right? Some of us walk through our entire lives in this numbness, this autopilot, and we don't notice it, because in a lot of our industries, especially, numbness and autopilot are highly rewarded. Can you set the table for the business meeting? Can you make sure the meeting gets to the objective? Can you make sure we do it in a time allocated? Congratulations, you get a promotion, right? So like this is that story that's really highly regarded. And then you get to 65, and this was the clientele that I originally started working with, were largely retired men, and they had gone their whole life in business, and they were looking around saying, "What the hell have I done with my life? I'm proud of the accolades. I'm proud of the awards. I'm proud of, supporting and providing for my family. And I don't know how to deal with the fact that I don't know my partner anymore. And I haven't in 50 years because I haven't my wholeness has not seen their wholeness." And I think that's another aspect of this, which is just really painful and important, is that if we can develop the practices early in life to be alive to our experiences, we don't turn out 65, 70 years old wishing we had said yes more.
It's like preventing and avoiding loss and regret.
Yeah. Because no matter what we do, terrible things are going to occur. Right? Like there's no stopping the terrible thing. And the posture we carry in the midst of that is the difference between a curmudgeon who takes it all into their body and so many of, I use the phrase wisdom teachers, elders might be another one. Like, the type of older person that has gone through hell and back and has this beautiful twinkle in their eye, like still makes jokes, still, right? Like, that is a powerful, and what is the takeaway? Like, what do I get from this? What is for that older person who has the twinkle in their eye, what are they modeling for younger generations, right? Beauty, like wonder, curiosity. And I think that's awe-inspiring.
It's the ability to, abilities, maybe the wrong word, but to be in self. And I think what people don't realize is how much energy that it takes to not be there. Like, you are using a lot of energy. You've talked about the no, but if you think of yourself like you're a conductor, like meaning like you're conductive, like metal, not like
Not
Aaron
that
doing
kind.
his conductor.
Okay.
Yeah. And you could run electricity through. There is, you get charged with this energy, and it wants to move through you. But if you're going to hold it because you're just not going to deal with whatever this thing is, then it will stay there and it will bother you. And then you will have to make an adjustment, which will happen to other adjustments and make more adjustments over a period of your curmudgeon little life. so, so then, and I feel like those are where the shadows are. So you have to actually just accept, and like you're saying in the first movement with gentleness, like, yeah, well, I've been storing some energy there, haven't I? Yes, I have. This
Yeah.
is actually real. And that's a first step that's actually vital, because if you don't, you can't actually do anything until you can look and say, well, there it is.
Yeah. I mean, it's the 12 steps, right? Like, it's important, and not just the 12 steps, but so many programs, so many modalities begin with, you have to start with some sort of oh shit moment. I see it for what it is. I'm not sure. We hadn't talked about me swearing on here, but like, but
We have to erase the whole episode now. You're
cool. This is just us talking.
Sounds
Then.
like a shadow that we weren't prepared for.
but that's so important, is that the first, when you're on that boat and you're looking into the depths, you're wondering what's there, you're immediately facing the urgent right there question of, am I about to enter into a moment that I'm going to see something for the first time that I can't come back from? And yeah, like, the answer is often yes, and it won't destroy you. And that's the gentleness part. And when we think about IFS, right, when you sit with your protector parts or your exile part, like, having a gentleness and an openness to recognizing that they are part of you. All your stories are part of you. They're there for a reason. How do we sit with them and understand their reason, instead of getting pissed and trying to just cast them out?
Yeah. And as you're saying that idea of gentleness and compassion is coming from yourself, not from the parts. Yeah. So it gives you the ability to interact with those shadows, which is where I want to ask you next, what would be kind of the starting point exercise? I mean, you've said some things, but I want like another layer into the shadow work, to kind of give the folks some ideas of how the shadow work happens.
Yeah. So I'll start with context. When I talk shadow work, I'm a pretty huge believer that personal work is, it doesn't mean a whole ton if you're not doing it in tandem with understanding how you show up in communities and collective spaces. And so when I do shadow work and lead workshops, which we're just wrapping up one next week, I introduce folks to a 3-part process. First part is your personal shadows. What are the things in your story that you have so far left untended to, unexamined, underexamined? Then when you enter into your communities, what are the stories or the narratives or the conversations in your communities that those who have power or shape the conversation, shape what is allowable to talk about? What are the things that they don't want to have talked about? And so they fester as unsaid, unspoken things that everybody knows about, but ain't nobody going to say anything. And then at the societal level, what are the things as a, me sitting here in the Northwest, the United States of America, what are the things that you cannot say in the United States of America without massive defensiveness? What are the the things, and we see it on TV every day, but what are those big pieces that as a collective, specifically those who have had historical power and have current power in the United States, have said are off limits? Don't bother challenging them. And if you do challenge, you're going to be torn apart. So that's kind of my quick disclaimer. When I introduce people into shadow work, the first level is always the personal, and it's because it's the most intimate and closest to us. It's also, I firmly believe, the hardest. And this is where therapy comes in, right? Like this is therapy, this is inner critic work. This is for me, I lead a lot of journaling practices and what I said earlier, like a texturing practice. But I also have this one practice that I'll just share it here, and it's one of the most valuable body-based practices that I've kind of, I don't know where I came up with it or if I just got it by osmosis from therapists and body workers, but it's a practice of, if you stand or sit in a space and then extend your entire body as big as it possibly gets. So, hands up and out, legs wide spreads. Your body's like full expansion, as big as you can possibly get. And just take a few moments to breathe and feel, what does it feel like to be fully expanded? And then slowly moving yourself down, tucking your knees, closing your arms, and getting as constricted as you can possibly get. And then doing that kind of rhythm, that in and out, expansion, constriction, 2 or 3 times. And what I have found in personal shadow work, and it has some ties into the collective as well, is that so many of us have been taught, along with who we are, we've been taught stories about how much space we can take up. Some of us have been taught that we can take up all the space. As a white male, I have been taught that I can take up way too much space, way more space than is mine. And some of us have been taught to take up way too little space, to silence ourselves when we have opinions. And so in your body, finding an embodied equilibrium that isn't too small and isn't too big, finding where it feels in your body, that natural kind of equilibrium space, and then taking that to the journal and imagining, all right, these narratives that I have that I've basically not looked at, because they challenge me, or I've been told not to think about them. What would it look like to carry an equilibrium? What would it look like to interrogate that shadow or interrogate that story I have and find, where is the equilibrium truth? What do I actually feel? What's my actual thoughts on this? That's usually where we start, is we identify, what's a story that is there, but you don't want to look at and you haven't wanted to look at, and then start to find, what are the access points? What are the questions you need to sit with? And then let's sit with them for a week, 2 weeks, and then come back. And that's the capacity building part. It just takes time.
Yeah. I love that. And everyone listening, you guys are all gonna think I'm weird and crazy for saying this, but I just watched the Joker for the first time. This is the Joaquin Phoenix version. And I watched it with my 14-year-old, and we were sort of, I guess, narrating along with the movie, kind of what's happening sort of in his progression from who he was originally into the Joker, which is kind of like he sort of lost touch with, himself and reality, and just he sort of broke or whatever. But the thing I love about that movie is you see, in a really strange, maybe in the opposite direction, but a strange way, somebody who was like taking up very little space, and you could see it. His acting was phenomenal, but he was like shrunken down, not making eye contact. His body was sort of shriveled into itself. And as the movie progresses, I mean, obviously in certain senses, he was like coming unraveled, but in another certain sense, he was sort of embodying himself, like this Joker, this guy that wanted to be a comedian and was comfortable with himself. And as that was happening, he was like opening up and smiling more and looking at people in the face and taking up, like dancing around. And again, it's just a movie, and it's sort of a villainous sort of a version of it. But I love seeing that progression of somebody sort of becoming more of, what's really good and true about them. In this case, obviously it was like a murderer, so please don't do that. If you're listening, like, go the opposite direction. This is not embracing the shadow.
That'd be one shadow taking over.
Yeah, exactly. But it's like integrating the shadow into the self. But anyway, I love that you're saying that, because it's when you see that in somebody, you're like, it gives you this sense of like, oh, this is you as a person. This feels really good, and you're engaging the world around you. So anyway, I would love to, just as we turn head for home here in this episode, you mentioned something that you wrote a book, and I'm assuming that it's kind of on the subject and it relates to everything we're talking about. So tell us a little bit about that, and where can our listeners find that book?
It's actually totally off sub. No, yeah, it's so the book is called Unmasking the Inner Critic: Lessons for Living an Unconstricted Life. And it's really this conversation. I'm a teacher by training, and so it's not a 500-page theory book. It's a workbook in a book, with lots of stories. And I look at what different therapists and trauma specialists, and including spiritual teachers, have taught for how do you move through the voices. How do you move through what the inner critic has taught you? How do you move with these narratives that you have, and through them, so that you can embody a more whole version of you, and really come home to whatever language you want to use, your true self, or your capital S self. But really, I come back to the word aliveness. The book is around how do you deepen in your sense of aliveness, so that you're not on autopilot for your whole life. And that's really, I think, the book comes from my experience of just doing it myself, and then my work in therapy myself, and then a lot of just the teachers that I found and really resonated with, whether it's like a 14th century mystic or a modern day trauma specialist. So it's all over the place, but it's a really lovely little book that's action focused.
Yeah.
Awesome.
So
Where can people find that book?
Find it on Amazon, super easy. You can also find it on my website, andrewglang.com.
And for those people that are wanting to embrace their shadow and stalk you everywhere on social media, like the freaking Joker, I'm just kidding. How can people find you on social media?
You can reach me on Instagram. The handle is Andrew G. Lang, and I basically just share quotes and random little musings about when I find a tree that I really like. That's pretty much it. It's largely trees, nature, and quotes.
You will find big shadows related to trees, I think, so it makes sense.
Everything's connected.
Yeah, right.
Oh my Lanta. Well, Andrew, thank you so much for joining us. It's been cool. It's just cool to see it is definitely a different flavor than like what we've talked about. We haven't talked about, you've definitely shared some new stuff for the show. And it's also cool for people, I think, to be able to reflect back on some of the other episodes we've had and go like, oh, that's an interesting way to look at that, different type of thing. So one way that I always end an episode is saying, have a great day.
Thank you. You as well.
Thanks for being on our show, Andrew. It was great to have you here.
Thank you.
Yeah, this was fantastic.
It's probably totally changed your life. I get it.
Life altering.
Have a great day.